I genuinely believe it's almost impossible to choose one version of the truth, one version of a story that stands alone. The act of remembering is a fictive process. You choose. So each time you remember, you actually recreate that memory in your brain. It's not like opening up a page of a book, it's like actually writing the book again and again and again. It ends up shifting and changing over time as you change as a person.
For episode 36, my guest is writer Tyler Wetherall. I read her book No Way Home, a memoir of life on the run, in less than 24 hours, needing to follow the beautifully written threads of how her life and the lives of those in this story weave together. Tyler and I first met at uni, and our lives constantly intertwine as we find more and more mutual connections. After I read Tyler's book, I remembered a night years ago where I think she told me about her father being in prison. It must have been a big deal at the time, but when we look back on it, neither of us can remember. We both have fond yet unspecific memories of the evening, which is just an example of how our memory can leave us gaps to fill. I wanted to speak to author and journalist Tyler, not to glamorize drug smuggling in any way, but because we can all relate to secrets that haunt us, or we in some way feel the need to run from. Parts of our history or her story that we make huge efforts to conceal or rewrite. Our world is made up of human beings and our stories, and so understanding how they work is crucial to creating a more beautiful future. In my intuitive therapy work, which I do outside of this podcast, I'm working with how we change our energetic responses to the past and trauma and the way it impacts our present. Epigenetics tells us that we are the sum of what has happened to us, but that we can change our cognitive framing of the past, which changes our story. You can choose not only the story you tell, but the story you experience. Tyler's memoir is a courageous endeavour to tell her story from not only her memory, but the perspective of her families, and as a result changes all of their relationships with the past. We have some new patrons from recent weeks that I want to thank: Elsie Parker, Lindsay Christensen, Claire Carter, Shelley Velubos, and Anna Murray. Thank you, wonderful women, for your support. And a shout out to Willow, Anna's little niece, who she dedicated her donation in honour of, in belief that we can create a beautiful future for the next generation. We now have 38 regular patrons, and some who have left one-off donations. We love that you want to support us and value what you are giving. It currently amounts to roughly £33 an episode, which you can imagine is a lot less than what the show costs to make. So if you've been meaning to support us, please do become a patron today. And you will have noticed that we've changed the music on the show to another artist in our community. Thank you to Bo Huntress for your sounds. If you haven't listened to episode 12 with Bo, please do check it out. And now, for our conversation with Tyler, after this. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. It's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. This is the revolution. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. Tyler, it's so lovely to see you again after a good few years since we last saw each other.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure. It was really interesting for me, so having known you for quite a long time, I guess maybe like 17 years or something since we first met.
That hadn't even occurred to me, but that's true. It has been that long.
I know, we don't look old enough.
No.
And then when I first saw that your book was coming out, got a sense of what it was about, I was like, wow, this was all part of who you were. Yeah. And of course I had no idea, as did probably most people in your life. Was it just when the book came out that you started to tell people about the way that you grew up, or was that something that you've always shared with closer friends?
No, certainly once the book came out, I had to come to terms with talking about it. But even at that point, it was really weird still. I only really ever told my closer friends, and even some of my closest friends, sometimes it wasn't a story I wanted to share. All my life it has been a part of me which has been hidden. It's strange. I never really thought about what an impact that must have had on who I was in relationships, with friendships or with lovers, because you're holding back this massive thing about yourself in your childhood that informed who you are. When I was growing up, it tended to be when I got too drunk and I would confess to a friend and then I'd regret it terribly the next day. And it was always I always felt very guilty after telling people because it'd been a secret for so long. I actually remember a friend at some point when I was writing the book and I still didn't tell anyone what it was about. I would say the story and I would say it happened to somebody else and that I had interviewed them and I was telling the story of their life.
Wow.
And a friend of mine, we were in a bar and she was like, you have to stop doing this. You have to, right now we're going to go tell these people what your book is about with some friends of hers. And she made me talk about it. It felt terrifying, but I also realized that this was something I was going to have to start doing casually, if only just when people say, what are you writing about? Be like, this is my story. And start being okay with that in practice for when it came out and it was on bookshelves and people were hopefully reading it. And it's still scary.
It gets me thinking about how we all have histories and all of our families have histories and then a sense of shame of actually things that are often very human. I mean, your story is fascinating and we're going to get there.
Yeah.
But often there's a sense that you can't tell people things that happen that are unusual or that are perceived negatively or that are difficult or that have conflict or things that can be easily misconstrued and judged. And actually we all have those things.
Yeah.
They are kind of part of who we are as humans. It's interesting just that, what does it take to share a story of something that really made you who you are, and yet that fear that we have of other people's judgment.
And so much in it is in our relationship to our past. So one of the reasons I was always reluctant to tell people was I was fearful that I would get upset, and I didn't like to show too much emotion publicly. I didn't want to cry. Because I talked about it so rarely, I wasn't practiced at sharing. So I wasn't sure what my emotional reaction would be to telling people. And sometimes when I told people, I did get upset. And sometimes when I told people, their reaction was to judge my family, and then that would make me fearful for the following time. So it was such a fraught process because I wasn't resolved on it. And the interesting thing is, having written this and having talked about it now so much publicly, I feel so much more resolved with it that I can tell someone at a dinner party and be like, oh, this was my childhood. And because I don't come at it with fear and with shame or with any conflict anymore, they take it for what it is. And that's really nice too. Like, oh, that's a wild story. You should turn it into a movie. Thanks. And then that's it. The interaction is over. And I can't believe how far that is from like the first very fraught confessions to friends when I was a teenager.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the way that people react to something is very much about the way that what we're holding when we share it.
Yes, I really believe that to be so. And I don't think it's something, or maybe somebody else can, but I don't feel it's something I was able to fake. So even if I tried to be kind of flippant about it and to share it in a non-heavy way, I still felt the heaviness came through regardless. And maybe that's because I'm a terrible liar and I'm no good at my face is an open book the whole time, so maybe someone else would be better at it. But I think for a lot of us, what we feel about something is evident when we're talking about it.
Well, your face is beautifully expressive. And it's nice to be around because of that. Because you feel like, I wonder, we have this culture that is changing, but around, holding things back and presenting a version of ourselves that is more acceptable, or that, won't be judged, or that will allow doors to open for us, or,
And I think we are moving into a culture that's much more accepting in general. If you think about just the world that we grew up in, what our parents would share or not share, and what was normal to kind of share. And then now, of course, we're in the world of like social media, and like you never knew, you just never had access to what people were having for lunch in so many parts of the world, for example, in one day. And now you do. Yeah. So there's a whole, something has also shifted in what we're accepting about. And I think with that there's a shift to share more of our pain and our difficulties, the journeys that we go on.
We're starting to realise that the normative family experience is really quite rare, and very few people have that, or even if that exists as an idea, the very concept of that is deeply flawed. But certainly when I was growing up, my mum was worried that if we told, so I was at an all-girls private school in Bath, which is a very lovely city, but people didn't have parents in prison. And so she was worried if I shared that my dad was in prison, that we would be ostracised by the other parents. I don't know now whether it would have the same impact or not, but certainly as I got older, I realised that everyone had their own secrets and their own like traumas and family issues to get over, and that actually it wasn't this massive thing that I needed to hide from people. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's, I can't tell with whether it's growing up and coming to terms with our past, or whether now does have a particularly open, there's a balance of both, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe we can't know because we are only coming at it from our own perspective, and whether there is something that's more general and collective, or whether, I'm sure there are lots of people that have a secret that's taking up a lot of space in them that they can't share.
It was lovely, actually. People have responded to the book who've had one friend who was gay and she didn't feel she could come out when she was at school, and that's such a different type of secret to mine, and yet the culture of secrecy around that, she felt she connected with the book on that level, and I found that made me so pleased, because my story is so unusual, and I was worried it would kind of be an outlier, like that people might find difficult to relate to with their own personal experience. So hearing that, I was like, wait, it's just about growing up and having secrets and being scared of sharing who you are, and that applies to so many different situations.
It's beautiful. Can you tell us?
I'm not going to skirting around next. I'll say, wait, when do I do the thing? When I was 9, I had lived in 13 countries in 5 houses, and I believed this to be normal, or relatively. One day, Scotland Yard turned up on our doorstep, and we found out that our father was a fugitive from the FBI, and we'd been on the run since I was 2 years old, which came as a shock. You really don't see that coming. And then Dad went on the run once again. At that point, he eluded capture, and we started visiting him as he fled around Europe for the following 2 years until he was eventually caught. And it was only then, once he was in prison, that he told us that he had been a pot smuggler in the 70s and 80s, importing enormous amounts of pot. He really got carried away from Thailand into California. So at that stage, you could have redefined who this person is again, like first of all, like dad, and then fugitive dad, and then, wow, kingpin dad, and then prison dad. So all these different characters our parents embody for us. And eventually you come out the other side of that, and then your parents are humans just like you, with all the same past regrets and mistakes and beliefs and inconsistencies and all those things.
And actually he was doing something that's now totally illegal in California. I mean, not the importing from Thailand part.
Well, I mean, he said in the 60s or 70s, I guess, it was Jimmy Carter and a very liberal administration. Everybody was smoking pot, and as far as he believed it was going to be legalized. And all of his friends, he'd be smoking in the cinema, I'd be smoking around the dinner table. It was very normal culturally. And so he was bringing in good pot for his friends at good rates, making some money at the same time. And he didn't see it as such a terrible crime. And he believed that the government is on the trajectory to legalize it. Of course, that didn't happen, and we got the Reagan administration and a massive crackdown on drugs, which has led to the mass incarceration problems that America is experiencing today, and a huge amount of injustice. He should have really stopped the moment those laws changed, because the atmosphere around drugs changed to a degree that what he was doing was looking at a life sentence rather than previously you'd have a couple of years. But unfortunately, at that point, his belief that he could get away with it had grown so much that he didn't think there was a problem he couldn't tackle, which of course was untrue.
What's amazing as well is how much resource went into following him and finding him. You were sharing about the photograph on the cover of your book, and that there are FBI agents in the background that most people won't notice when they look into the picture.
Yeah, I should have put a note somewhere in there explaining that front cover is, my parents were on honeymoon in Maui shortly after the investigation had begun. Dad had an informant who told him that 2 FBI agents had come to Maui with us undercover, posing as a couple, staying opposite us in the resort we were in. And on the cover is a picture of my mum looking pretty steely-faced and holding me, gripping me under her arm, with my brother and my sister, and in the background are the FBI agents taking photographs back at us, and she's looking pissed because Dad was making her pose, and I think she was just like, we're on honeymoon and I can't believe this is happening and you're making me pose for photographs and this is all unacceptable. Yeah, I mean, huge amounts of resources, because his was one of the first cases handed to these new drugs task forces that were created to combat the drug problem. So previously it was the DEA, not to get into too much detail, but like it went from being in the DEA to being the FBI with the Coast Guard, with all the resources were available to them. And it was a kind of perfect FBI case because they found the books that had not been burnt. And so it was like code names and numbers and a process of trying to decipher this thing to find out who had imported millions of dollars worth of marijuana into the States. I think they probably cared because there was a lot of money involved.
So there were FBI agents that were probably having sleepless nights trying to find this man, like we've seen in all the TV dramas.
And we're just having a normal family life. Like my mum's growing vegetables in the garden, and we lived in this beautiful yellow house with a lake, and we had some rescue ponies in the garden and kept chickens. Our existence was not what the stereotype of a kingpin's family might appear to be. It's still surreal to think about what our lives were.
And when you found out, did it make sense? Were there clues that, had you noticed that your parents were hiding this big secret?
Yeah, I mean, yes, there were clues, but I think kids are amazingly resilient. When I look back on my childhood, I think I had a very happy childhood. Of course, there were these moments that were interrupted by very traumatic events, but on the whole, our family had a very full and happy, wholesome existence together. And kids accept the reality as it is presented to them because you don't have a point of comparison, and you adapt. It was strange that we moved so often. So the first couple of years we moved every few months, and then we settled in Portugal because they didn't have an extradition treaty with the States, and that turned out to be more complicated than we had thought. So we moved again to the south of France, but my mum really didn't like it there. She wanted to go back to England and to be in a country that she felt she had some identity in, because one thing about living under false identities is you really lose so much of yourself. So in those years we were moving, yes, that if we had thought about it, it probably would have struck us as strange. And there must have been a conversation where they told us our names are changing, but none of us remember it. Mm-hmm. It just was accepted. Though I went through a stage when I was little where I changed my name every day. And I wonder if that was as a result of being told that our names were changing. And then I was like, oh, okay, so we can change our names whenever we want. Mm-hmm. So I'd wake up in the morning and be like, today I am Rainbow Sunshine. And then the next day I was like, I am today Moondrop. There's like all the variations on the kind of rainbow themes.
Basically, you're a My Little Pony.
Yes, pretty much. Dream My Little Pony. And like Dad never travelled with us. He would travel separately, so if he got caught, we wouldn't see it. My name on my passport was my real name, so we didn't, my siblings and my mum never travelled under false documentation because Mum was very concerned not to break the law. Mm-hmm. If Dad did go to jail, that we would always have a parent. And I knew my name on my passport was different than the name I went by, Tyler Kane and Tyler Wetherall. But I didn't ever consider it deeply. You're capable of believing two things to be true and not questioning them. And of course, looking back now, it's like, well, of course, it was a glaring inconsistency. I did a family tree when I was at school. I still have it. There's like me and my family, the Kane family, and then our grandparents have totally different surnames. And I wonder if the teacher was like, she's obviously confused because this can't be right.
Yeah. So you never felt a sense of anyone at school was watching?
No, I mean, so Mum told us when I was 9, and at that point we were under surveillance, and I was aware. It's hard to know how much there was. We were aware of being followed home from school, about a car following us home, and we saw them waiting across the sort of two kind of agents waiting for us after school once, twice. But then once you've seen it once, then you have an atmosphere of anxiety, of being observed. We knew our phones were tapped. Our car was probably bugged and our house was probably bugged. So we were very cautious about what we said. And I think that, to go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, I think that fear of telling, of speaking about it, came from that time where we knew we couldn't talk about Dad out loud in the house or in the car or on the phone, because we knew that those conversations might be overheard. We knew we shouldn't talk about him to other people in case Mum was always worried that the FBI would pose as another set of parents and be like, oh, so where's your dad? And then we would tell them and that he'd be caught. So I think that culture of secrecy began at that point because of the surveillance.
How many years did you have of knowing before he was caught?
2.5 years. 2.5 years. So he was caught when I was 12. Those 2.5 years were very surreal because we kind of got into a routine that felt almost normal again, of visiting him in Europe. And he'd try and make it fun. So we'd kind of go water skiing in France, or we'd spend winters in the Alps, and we'd go visit him in Switzerland and go skiing in the Alps. And so he tried to make each of those trips. And they were holidays. We did wonderful things during those times.
And how is he? Like, have you talked to him, like, in the process of writing the book? Have you talked to him a lot about what all this was like for him?
Yeah, a huge amount. It's doing this book has brought us much closer. I mean, we always were close, Dad and I. For him, those years he was incredibly anxious about what might happen, trying to shelter us as much as possible from the impact of the investigation. But Dad always cared about us deeply, and he didn't want to let time go without seeing us. And one of the reasons he went on the run originally was because he didn't want us to grow up without having a dad in our lives. I mean, I'm sure also no one wants to go to prison, and that was a big part of it. But he felt he would rather go to prison when we were older, but he felt when we were younger, having a relationship with him was very important. Going on the run, if that brought him, and even now he says he doesn't regret that decision, even though it led to 12 years of kind of intense situations being pursued. But it meant that we had those very precious early years together. The book was originally his idea, really. It was his story. I was telling his biography. And that meant that we sat for hours together as he told me everything, his whole life story, from childhood up until all the decisions he made that got him into the business. And that process, I feel like I now know his life. Maybe better than he knows his, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. And in a way, better than a lot of us get to know our parents.
Yes, and I feel very privileged for that. Both my mum and my dad made extraordinary decisions and led extraordinary lives. To know them better through this is really special. I'm grateful for it.
And have your mum and your siblings, this has obviously meant that people in their lives know more than they might have told them. Have you all kind of been holding each other through that process?
We have. It's definitely been harder than I perhaps anticipated. It's been very emotional to put out there, and I never wanted this to impact any of my family in a way that was difficult for them. I think overall it's something that has led us to have a better relationship with our past, but certainly it's tough. I think every memoirist probably has this feeling of being selfish. It's like, I needed to tell this story and I needed to write this book. They didn't. So I chose. And they've supported me all the way through, and they have shared their stories with me, and I wouldn't have done it without their support, and all the way through trying to find those limits of privacy and boundaries and be respectful of them, while also being honest. Yeah, there's a part of me still grappling with the responsibility of that and how I could have done it better, or I don't know. I think it's something that all memoirists struggle with, is the way your story naturally overlaps with other people's.
Your story can't help but expose others because they're part of it too. I wonder, as a creative, how much choice there really is. Because on one level you're like, well, you chose to write this story, and could have written about anything else. Rainbows, for example. And I know from my own experiences, and then also from talking a lot to other creatives on the show and in life, that often a creative project just sort of comes as this very strong, intense kind of mission almost. It's not something that you can easily just sort of put down and just be like, actually, no, that's going to be too problematic.
Yes, and I tried often to put it down. So it started as Dad's biography, and then I felt like I couldn't tell. I was finding myself being angry with him because in his story, he's the hero of his story. He deserves to have that narrative. That is right, that he has found that narrative of his own. But it was making me feel angry that he wasn't taking on board the people who were hurt by his decisions, rather than just this grand adventure in drug smuggling. Actually, there was damage done. And so it then became a novel, and then it became a memoir. That process took, from inception to publication, 10 years. So yes, there must have been something driving me, and enormous amounts of rejections from publishers and agents, and each of those times that would happen, I'd be like, why am I doing this? This is crazy. It's really hard, and I have no idea, what it's going to feel like or what repercussions they might be if I put this story out into the world, and yet I'm still doing this against all odds. And that has to be some sort of creative drive. And I would try and write other things, and other things would just circulate around this. It would be, it'd start somewhere else, then it'd come back into the territory of the stories that we tell in order to survive, the way we grew up, the memories we have, what they mean, our relationships with our parents, being nomadic, being, what is home, where do we find home? So it always was another version of this anyway.
It's interesting, this idea of this version is from your perspective, and then that in a film version, just getting to really be with every character and see how they're viewing it.
Yes, and I tried really hard in this. So when I changed it to a memoir, one of the reasons why I was so reluctant was because I genuinely believe it's almost impossible to choose one version of the truth, one version of a story that stands alone. And I felt it was kind of audacious to say, this is how it happened. And there were some inconsistencies in the story between different people's versions that were impossible to align. So writing a book is a process of making choices about which version of the truth and which version of the story you're going to tell or prioritize. And in doing this, what I tried at those junctures was to be totally transparent about it. So at this moment, this person said this and this person said this, and it's impossible to know. And here it is for you on the page. And at other moments, when you naturally have to build a world for a memoir, you can't. Your memories are like the architectural blueprints, and then you have to color in that world. And I write about a lot of things that happened to my parents that I wasn't there for. So I tried again to be transparent in that process of, this is a story that my mother told me, and then I'm going to build this world up, and maybe it's something like this, and trying to always show that the act of remembering is a fictive process, and I'm not saying this is the only way this might have happened. There are many ways, and all those other stories are just as valid and just as important.
It's really interesting, this idea of how different people remember the same event.
It's really problematic as well. Yeah. I mean, in this profession, really problematic.
Well, and just in everyone's relationships.
Everyone, yeah, totally.
Across time.
Well, and then you end up, I feel like, as long as you can understand that it's a choice. So you choose, so each time you remember, you actually recreate that memory in your brain. Your memory doesn't exist in a place. It's a series of synaptic connections which are triggered by a stimulus. And so it's not like opening up the page of a book, it's like actually writing the book again and again and again. When you recall something about your past, you might choose to recall certain details of it over other details because they are more pertinent to either what is happening in your life at that moment or more pertinent to your sense of self. So your identity is linked to certain aspects of your past which you feel relate to who you are. So you might tell a story emphasizing one part of that story because it's more relevant to you. But each time you do that, you're solidifying that memory in that telling of it. So it ends up shifting and changing over time as you change as a person. Our past isn't a static thing. It is constantly shifting and changing and morphing along with us. And our relationship to the past is always changing. The idea of writing a book, I mean, like, it's on the page and done now. It's very unnatural in many ways. I wish this could keep morphing and changing as my relationship with the past changes and my memories change. And I like this idea, like if you think of it visually, everyone's different sort of stories and memories of the past they're all kind of together, aren't they? Like threads of plait. I feel, and you choose which thread to follow when you tell a story. Does that make any sense?
It absolutely totally makes sense. And it also relates to, we all have an inner story that's being played all the time of our own lives and of what's happening in our lives. And whatever that narrative, that inner narrative that we choose affects how we view conversations or the things that happen to us. I was talking recently to a guest to Han about pronoia, so like the opposite of paranoia, where you actually have a sense that things are conspiring to help you grow.
That sounds lovely.
But it's just a mind shift. Instead of being like, this person's out to get me, no, this person's out to help me, and maybe they're helping me by taking away the job that I thought I wanted, but it's just a different way of seeing things. And I do this intuitive therapy work with clients, which is all about going into the subconscious and looking at the patterns that form us and the energetic trauma that we hold. And as you clear those patterns and you open up new things, your feelings of the past shift. Like the way that the energy of your past is being held in your system shifts. And so then that also means that the way in which you experience the present shifts because of the way that your story has shifted. So it's the same as what you're saying.
Yes.
But in a more kind of energetic framework. So it completely makes sense.
Well, and it's lovely to hear that because I came at this to write a book, to tell a story. I wasn't searching for closure or searching for therapy or all the things that have come from it, that renegotiation of my relationship to the past and that understanding of what that process is and how that power that we have to look back, to retell, to re-narrate can be applied to everything. So I've learned that through the process of writing and realizing that as I was writing, my memories were even changing. Even in the process, they felt different. Like when I thought about the past, it started to feel different. And then you realize, wait, I can do that in any area of my life. I can go back to it and retell it and find a way that it sits well with us. And what is this like? You have a coherent, I can't remember where the quote is from, to have a coherent narrative of the past is your sense of self requires having a coherent narrative of the past, and that those two things are connected. And so we're constantly retelling. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because then you're like, can you ever have a coherent narrative of the past if you're open to that being something that's constantly changing and evolving? Because I think often we can get quite stuck into our stories, like this happened to me. And so, you know, you see it a lot with the victim narrative, which I've definitely lived at different points of my life, where I've been very tapped into how certain things that happened to me meant that this was my experience. Or you see people that are very much have put themselves, and then everyone around them has also put them into boxes that make a certain way of living, a certain way of seeing the world the only possibility. But if we see ourselves as more malleable and almost that the past and the present and the future are kind of happening simultaneously, then if the past is always open for change, for shifting, there's something that we missed, then it gives us this perspective to actually always be open to something new, a new way of understanding ourselves. And that means that our sense of self is something that can always shift and open. I don't know if that makes sense. But I mean that there's an opportunity there, not like in a sense of like, oh, well, that's scary that you can't have a sense of self, but that your sense of self isn't a solid structure. And actually, the more rigid your sense of self is, the harder that makes it to grow, to expand, to experience things that you didn't know were possible.
And adapt as well, because we have to. In our current lifestyles, we're always forced to adapt. I read an interesting book called The Memory Illusion by Dr. Julia Shaw, which is actually focused more on crime and how witness statements are flawed because memory is flawed. She's a neuroscientist, and she goes into the process of what happens, a bit like what I was talking about earlier, what happens when we remember. Then she goes into why it is that our memory is flawed. So the ability of our memory, when we tell a story for a second time, if you influence that person and show them a picture or ask them a leading question, the next time they recall their statement, they might have incorporated that leading question or that photograph into their memory because it's been added to whatever box that is kept in. So she was basically talking about the flawed nature of witness statement, and then goes into why. And I found this really fascinating because our brains are utilitarian, and we're just trying to survive better and take care of ourselves. So the flawed nature of memory serves a purpose for us. And I think that purpose allows us to be creative and allows us to adapt to new situations. So having a perfect, flawless memory of a past doesn't allow us to be better as we move forward into our future. And then if you think about it that way, then you can accept this idea of the shifting, changing nature of the way we recall what's happened to us as a positive part of our growth. And it allows us to confront new situations with openness and creativity. It's quite a stretch from what she was saying. But that's what I got from it.
Yeah, I see that. I really like that. So we do it all the time, kind of naturally. For example, you come out of a relationship and you're like, oh, it's awful. And then you go and talk, you have some time, and then you go and talk with your friends and people that knew both of you in that partnership, and you get different bits of information that allow you to see it differently, and either that allow you to see something that you thought was beautiful as something that had, that maybe was still beautiful, but that you thought was really good for you as something that wasn't, or that something that you thought was awful, you're like, oh wow, no, like they were doing this and there was this, and I just didn't notice those bits.
Yeah.
And when we change our past in terms of what we notice, then that really changes what that event meant.
Yes, it's like changing the emphasis, like turning up the tone or contrast on our memories of like that bit, I'm going to turn that bit down and that bit's going to get turned up, and it's all there as for us to choose from. It's really true. Actually, the time we do it most often is after a relationship. It makes me think of, friends will come to you and be like, oh, I just want to talk to him again so I can understand better what's happened. And I always feel like saying it doesn't matter what he says. His version of events is kind of irrelevant. All that matters is that you have come to an understanding of what happened in a way that you can live with, a story that fits with your sense of self and what your role in it was, and that you're happy to remember it as such. In fact, he has his story or she has her story, and it doesn't necessarily, once you've parted ways with someone, it's more just like, what is the story that I want to go forward in my future with? What is the story that I want to tell people when I talk about it? What is the way what is the emotional experience of this relationship that I want to share and sit with? And you can sit with pain and regret, all these other negative emotions, or you can choose to resurrect it and to be like, oh, this was good for these reasons, and this is why it ended in a way that makes sense to you.
This is what I got from it. It's what I'm taking with me that allows me to grow.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess we do that with everything. And I say all this, and I'm such a sucker for regret. Yeah, I feel like it's something I'm constantly, maybe I talk about it because I'm constantly working on it. My sister once, when I'd come out of a really difficult relationship and it had ended very badly, and I really regretted my role in it. And I'd stay up at night, like I can't sleep, thinking about what I should have done differently and how I behaved, and just wishing that I could go back and make a different decision. It was driving me crazy. My sister made me make a boat to my regret. So we're on a beach in Colombia. We made a boat out of little wooden twigs on the beach, and I named my regret. I can't remember what my regret was called, but the ship of my regret, and we set fire to it and sent it off to the ocean as a funeral pyre.
Beautiful.
I don't know how long that worked for. Maybe it bought me. Actually, no. I think the following year, I think it did help in some strange way. Yeah, I think the nice thing about this, of having done this book, is I do feel very resolved on my childhood now and on the past and what happened. It's slightly weird in that I feel like a line, once it was on the page, a line was drawn. And it was like, that is how it was. And I like what we're saying, I know that's going to change. And so when people ask me about the past, it doesn't conjure up a whole bunch of different emotions. It kind of just, it's just there. It's done. And I don't know if that's natural when we've written a book for that to have happened, because it's drawing a line in the sand that doesn't exist. I feel it as well. And I think part of that is because when you narrate a memory, you're turning something sensory into something linear, and that changes the nature of your memory. It's kind of that very shifting, emotional. It's like your memories, when you think back on them, they're kind of esoteric, aren't they? You have glimpses here and there. They're fragmentary. That's the natural state of memory. And then you turn what is fragmentary into a line on the page, and you're reducing all those shifting feelings down into something narrative based, so the beginning, middle, and end, even the level of sentence structure. And so now when I think back on my childhood, I think of it in terms of story rather than those lovely, natural, hazy memories that we have. And occasionally I'll remember something that I didn't write about, and I will have the experience of like a natural memory of the hazy, wonderful feeling of it. And it's so sweet and so nice. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's what it's meant to feel like. I was like, I don't want to write any more about my childhood. So I keep some memories as real memories, not just lines on the page.
Well, hopefully quite a lot, because you can't get a whole childhood into a book. And this is quite a strange time as well, because you're having to talk about it to strangers and journalists and do all these interviews. It will be interesting to see how that shifts in a year or 2 years or 3 years.
Yeah, it's that thing, isn't it? There's this lag between something happening to you and our ability to make sense of it. And I know that this process from the book, so the book came out in April, and these few months, God, I can't believe it's only been a few months. It feels like years. This time of talking about it and being asked really fascinating questions and things I hadn't, been shown things I hadn't even seen in it before. And I know that when I look back on it, that I'll see a shift in myself, but I am too deep in it right now to recognize what is happening. I'm just kind of going with it.
Hello, this is Amisha. We are just taking a little break from the conversation here. On behalf of myself and the team, I want to say thank you for being part of creating a beautiful future. We make this for you, so that we will all have the vision, wisdom, and activism we need at this time to weave a new narrative. Can you help us with this? You can do that by making a monthly donation to the podcast to cover our costs. Just the equivalent of a fair trade banana you might eat or a chai latte you might drink whilst you listen to this will make a huge difference to us. Head to www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/community to become a monthly patron. And the other thing is to tell your friends about this podcast so they can tune in too. Send them a message or post on social media and let them know what you love about it. And whilst you're at it, leave us a review. And now, back to the conversation. Thank you for your loving beauty.
You mentioned earlier when you were talking about your mum wanting to be in England, that when you have false identities, that it makes it really hard to have a sense of self or to kind of hold on to your sense of self. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah. When I think back on when I found out my name wasn't my name, I felt very attached to my name. I liked it. And then I carried on living in that name for another 2-3 years until I switched to Wetherall. And then I became this other person. And the strange thing about it was, in that time, I kept telling the stories that we had told as a cover story about our lives. When people asked what Dad did or why we'd moved so often, I would say what I had believed to be true, only then I knew it was untrue. And then when I became Tyler Wetherall, I kept saying those same things. So it was your story, everything that you believed made up who you were and who my family was, which is kind of very, especially as a kid, very integral to your identity. All of it was suddenly baseless. And that left me feeling, I think, quite ungrounded in who I was. I don't know exactly what impact that had as a kid. I was a pretty wild teenager, and I think I might have been anyway. I could blame that on circumstance, but I think maybe that's just who I am. And I think writing this story and telling it and finding a way to do that has helped ground my sense of self more so than it was before. Though I still don't know how to answer questions like, where are you from? I don't know how to answer these things without going, either being like, and just read the book, it's all in there, or saying something that feels untrue. I don't know what nation I belong to. I don't know where I'm meant to call home. And the only root of it I found is that for me, home feels like it's my family. It's not a place, it's a feeling I get around the kitchen table when we're all together. And that's probably the most grounded I can be, is in that moment.
I think there's a lot of us now that don't know where we're from.
Yeah.
And what that kind of sense of home means. That question, where are you from?
It's so
as a brown woman.
Yeah.
Obviously, my whole life, people would be like, where are you from? And then I'd be like, Derbyshire. And they just not what I'm looking for. And I would be like, I'm not telling you, I'm not going there. You know, which was my own kind of coming to terms with often being the only brown woman in any room I was in, the only brown person in any room I was in. And then now it's hilarious because people go, where are you from? And I just go, Gujarat in India. And it's like, it's also not exactly true. Yeah. I'm just like, that's what you want. And then I tell them all these like anecdotes about being Indian, which are also part of my life, but they're not, you know, that's also a little bit dishonest. I live in a flat in Hackney and I've grown up in England.
Do you find your story changes? Like, so for me, it's become where like, depending on where I'm in, like what room I'm in and who I'm talking to and how much time I want to invest in the question or in the relationship with that person, my answer changes. It's like the easy answer. So people say, where are you from? I'm like, London, which is not true. I lived here for 8 years, but I'm not from here. That's just more straightforward.
Yeah.
And then there's other times when I'm feeling like I want to engage more and I'll say California, which is very confusing because I don't sound like I'm from California, but I was born there, so it is true. So do you find you do that? You sort of change your answer?
Absolutely. And if you just go for the big city, then that's quite oh, okay, fine. You can be from London or New York or something without it Everyone's from everywhere, and clearly you're not like a native, and people can tell that, but it's fine. Yeah, and then I think if you want to go into deeper conversations, or people do also like you can tell what people are interested in.
Yeah.
Often after a few questions.
Or how you want to define yourself to that person. I guess it should be more, you do want to please when you're in a conversation and give someone what they want, what they're looking for. But also there's a part of you that can choose, how do I want to be seen in this moment? And how do I want that person to think of me? And the different ways, like even if I say I'm from Bath or I'm from London, that changes how someone categorizes me. And people shouldn't be doing that, because neither of those things tell a full story. But we are all making small, hopefully unweighted judgments all the time about people we're talking to, trying to fill out our narrative of who they are. In America, I found myself wanting to make sure people know I'm British. I'm not British. I just sound British, and I identify as British. I feel much closer to British culture than American culture. I'll invest more into my Englishness when I'm in America than when I'm here. And that's because, that's how I want them to see me.
Yeah, well, and also then the fascination with the British accent that happens in America. Hello to all our American friends that are listening.
Yeah.
I've definitely caught myself when I've lived in America. My accent gets even more British in that environment. But then in the same way that when I'm in India, my accent gets quite Indian, and I actually like format sentences in an English version of Hindi, because that's how they're understood. And then the more time you're there, then the more because that's how you can connect. And a lot of it is about connection, in the same way that if an Asian taxi driver in London asks me where I'm from, then I say India straight away, because I know that that's the connection that they're looking for and that I'm looking for, and that's a sense of like of that in the city. Or likewise, if I'm meeting someone that's spent a lot of time in India and they've got a kind of a genuine fascination, then it's really nice to talk about that more and explore it as a form of connection.
That's a much nicer. I was thinking what I just said earlier about weighted judgments, and actually that's a much truer thing. What we're really looking for when we ask someone, where are you from, is to make sense of them to ourselves, but it is also looking for an avenue through which that connection can be built and the conversation can move into more interesting territory and a deeper understanding of one another.
But if I do feel judged, then that's when London, like, and like, a bit of a like, there's no follow-up questions happening here, in the way that I say it will happen too.
Yeah.
Just like in the same way that then when the taxi driver asks me if I'm married, I'm like, yes, of course. Like, because there's just like, because there's just there's no point in leaving that open.
No.
Yeah. I used to think when I travelled that I had to be very honest in all situations. And then I think sometimes as a woman, when you're travelling by yourself, you realise that sometimes you have to also just protect yourself a little bit. So you say things like, oh, no, well, my husband's like staying, or he's coming to meet me later, or, you know.
I've totally
and they
done
just
that.
Start rolling out.
Multiple imaginary husbands in hotel rooms all around the world.
Yeah. Poor guys. They should be let out more. And I've had a
Their
thing
wives
of like,
off on adventures.
Is that lying?
Yeah.
Does that take something away from authenticity? Or, as you know, sometimes you have to lie.
I think if it facilitates our ability to travel as women, which is such a difficult thing to do in so many places, I feel it's totally fair game.
Yeah. And of course, on your father's side, he did that so that he could spend more time with you.
Yes. That's a stretch, but I'll take it.
Well, that's kind of what you said there.
No, totally. And it's funny, so my mum hates lying and is not someone who is duplicitous at all.
She seems like quite an unlikely character to have lived this life.
Yes, I mean, in some ways, likely because she's adventurous. She was a model in the 60s from 16 and lived in Paris and then moved to New York. And so she led this amazing life, and her modeling paid her way to go to NYU to study. And so she was not someone who was shy of adventure. And if anything, actually, Dad is one who, he's led a very adventurous life, but he also really likes he likes going to the same place on holiday because he knows it's good, and he likes going to restaurants that he knows is good, and he'll tend to order the same things when he eats. So in many ways,
he liked smoking a spliff.
Yeah, exactly.
Putting his feet up.
Yes, regularly. When he raised it as an idea, it seemed like a better option than him going to prison. Like, well, this is an adventure. We're going to go on an adventure as a family. And the alternative is you go to prison, they take everything from us, and then she'd be raising us as a single mom alone and trying to figure out what that looked like. I don't have... People always ask if I wish things were different, and I really don't. I'd like a little bit less heartache. And I think, my mum definitely got the brunt of it because they knew where she was and they didn't know where Dad was. So she got harassed extensively by the authorities in the UK. And I wish that hadn't been so awful. In the grand scheme of things, it's like, this is what made me who I am. I can't wish it to be different. And there's lovely perks about it. Like, we're talking about traveling as women alone. I've been a lifelong traveler. It felt very natural to get on a plane and go to somewhere else around the world and find a rhythm and a routine and find people. And I'm sure my childhood moving so often, and me and my siblings getting on a plane and visiting Dad in St. Lucia or wherever he was, and we were flying alone for years and we're totally comfortable and confident doing it, and navigating airports and experiencing different cultures. That has gifted me as an adult the ability to do that with great ease and with huge excitement about it. Obviously there are other ways to go around giving your kids that experience. This is quite an extreme one, but I'm grateful for it, and I think that's important. When I was younger, I wished that he hadn't got caught, and I wished I could have grown up. I wanted to be Californian, and it's funny actually, the opposite. I would say I was American when I was younger, even though I was here in England and I'd never lived in the States. But I had this, I wanted our house in California to have stayed. I wanted my parents to have stayed together. I imagined this version of myself that was unwounded by events of the past, that was better than my current version of myself, and would invest in that daydream version, even though she doesn't exist and she never would have existed, and there would have been other things, and who knows what the future might have held if Dad hadn't got caught. This process has taken away those regrets, and I see that for the fantasy it is, and for it's empty space. It's not a real thing to wish for. I'm glad for the story.
Did your dad feel an inevitability of being caught?
No. No, he's an optimist. He definitely preempts things going wrong, which is why he was so good at what he did for so long. I mean, he was smuggling for, I guess, 10 years. He was very good at seeing areas of potential hazard and preparing for them. But he was always very sure of himself and he felt he was very careful in what he did, wasn't at risk of getting caught. He said he wouldn't have done it if he thought he was going to get caught. And that kind of hubris is astonishing, because I'd be so scared to get, 30 tons of marijuana landing into the California coast. And I think it's like one time the Hells Angels were arranged to transport it from the boats to the vans, and that whole process, I would be terrified. But I think because the deals were incrementally got bigger, so he was able to insulate himself every single time from those fears. If you ask him, do you wish it turned out differently? He says he just wishes he'd never got caught. So he doesn't have regrets either. I'm sure some sneak in there, but on the grand scheme, that's how he looks back on it.
But on the run, he also felt like there was a possibility of not being caught.
Yeah, once we were on the run, he was very anxious. And I think that's part of what chipped away at his and my mum's marriage took over his life at that point. The charges against him were far more serious than he had anticipated, so he was looking at a lot more time than he had thought. And at that point, he got very nervous, naturally, about getting caught. All of his time was spent trying to prevent the progress of the investigation against him. And eventually he settled in London under his fake identity. It seemed like the investigation had reached a dead end. If he had kept his nose clean at that point, then is that the right expression? I always get expressions wrong. I think that's the right expression. Then he would have been fine, but he started working with another pair of smugglers, and so we ignited interest in him. Even I guess he had this years of anxiety, but even as soon as he'd settled into his new identity and the investigation had ended, it didn't take very long for him to get back into a situation where he felt secure again.
Mm-hmm. And then needed the excitement again.
Yeah, and I guess it's part of just who he is, that belief that it's going to be okay. Mm-hmm. Against all odds.
And so where is everyone now?
My mum is down in Cornwall, and my brother and sister are here, and they are a doctor and lawyer.
In London?
The countryside. My dad is in San Francisco, just outside in Marin County, working as a financial manager. So his roots were on Wall Street. So he's just getting back to his roots. People are always surprised when I say he's a financial manager. It's like, no. He started out on Wall Street. He just got distracted by the 60s. Which I think is understandable.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I do worry that my parents led far more extraordinary lives than I'll be able to. You can't really match that in terms of adventure and escapades. I'd like to avoid the prison bit if possible.
Totally. And are they still friends, your parents?
Yeah, I wouldn't say they're friends. They're not, they don't hang out. But Mum's not really someone who stays in touch with people unless there's a few people she cares about very deeply she stays in touch with. But she's, like my dad's someone who just wants to have, he really invests in his friendships. He's got people all over the world. He spends a huge amount of time on the phone, keeping up with everyone. And Mum likes having relationships in person with people that are around her and are part of her world. So they don't, just a different size. If they were in the same place, maybe. But yeah, there's not bad blood.
And they kind of both chose different ways to have new chapters.
Yeah, well, because Dad was in prison in the States, so he got extradited out back to California, and then he kind of had to stay there because he was only in the UK. His fake identity was British, so he could live and work here. But once he was himself again, which is a strange thing, he lived under a fake identity he was in a fake identity for 12 years, and then he was in prison, so you're a prisoner number. So if you think, really, at that point, it's 20 years that he spent not fully embodying himself. I think that's really interesting. And then you get out the other side, and then you are you again, and you are building your life up from scratch. I think it's really admirable that he did that. I remember him not being worried about it. I was so worried about what his life would be like once he was out, and if he'd be okay. And he was very confident about being able to build up a life for himself again. I'd like some of that self-belief that he has. He's very good at it.
Well, you have it. Because you also moved to New York, built a life there, have a life in London.
Yes, I'm still astonished by these things.
Just written a book.
I approach them with great caution.
It's perspective though, isn't it? Because I'm sure that people in your life view you as somebody that is adventurous and daring and courageous.
Oh, that's lovely. I hope so.
Totally. Well, Tyler, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. This has
talking.
been lovely.
And yeah, I recommend to everyone to read No Way Home. You have a website, don't you, where people can find you?
Yeah, tylerwetherall.com, and there's links on there to buy the book, generally available.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for spending your precious time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog, We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible with you, our community. If you loved this and would like to fund our show with a monthly donation or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on Community and Support. Please also share with friends, hit subscribe, and leave us a review so we can grow. Those gold stars really help others find us, so these ideas can spread. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together. The Future is Beautiful is made by an all-female team working voluntarily or on reduced rates until our listener support grows. If you have been moved by anything you heard here, please donate the equivalent of buying us a drink. All donations make a huge difference to us and will allow us to keep doing this and remain advertising free. Until next time, I leave you with this question. How will you create beauty in the world?